And if you look at my experience with the IMF in the past, I can tell you, even in the IMF, there have been all the time smart people who know that there is a major problem with the exchange rate system. But I tell you, and I have to tell everyone outside there, believe it or not, they are not allowed to talk frankly about it. They're not allowed. Why are they not allowed? Because the Americans do not want the US government. It's not Trump or Bush or whoever, all the governments, no government, including Obama, no government in the United States wants to talk about a question like a stable exchange rate regime, because there are these nice guys out in Wall Street who give us so much money for our party and for everything. So we cannot discuss it. We do not want to discuss it, and we do not allow the IMF to discuss it. It's very simple like that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lauretta, and you're listening to a new 6-part podcast series brought to you by the Eurafrican-Alliance, where we tackle the major forces shaping global economics, migration, and financial flows. Before we dive in, let's take a quick look at the road ahead. We're starting with Global Economics Part 1. We'll be taking a micro look at Africa at the crossroads. Later in the series, we will bring it all full circle in Part 2, where Professor Flassbeck and Dr. Kaczmarczyk reunite to analyze the new global order and the future of BRICS. In between, we have a fascinating 3-part trilogy on remittances led by Simona Schreier, breaking down the human element, the digital infrastructure, and the future policy frameworks of financial flows. Plus, we will shine a spotlight on migration dynamics with specialized insights from Professor Flassbeck. To take these topics a step further, we are officially launching our very first interactive webinar series alongside with the podcast. It's an open invitation for you to connect directly with our guests, challenge their insights, and put your questions straight to Professor Flassbeck. From September through November, you can join us live in real time. Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Now let's dive straight into the next episode. Hello, and a very warm welcome to a new episode of the Eurafrican-Alliance podcast. My name is Lauretta, and I'm the Vice Chairman of the Eurafrican-Alliance, a non-profit organization here in Germany. We are dedicated to strengthening cooperation between Europe and Africa through dialogues, knowledge exchange, and sustainable development initiatives. I'm very happy to be your host today and grateful to have you joining us. Today, we're taking a deep critical look at the global economy and shifting our focus to a continent that is all too often viewed through a highly narrow lens. And that continent is Africa. Even the maps many of us grew up with tend to underestimate its true scale. In reality, Africa covers more than 30 million square kilometers, is home for 54 countries and over 1.4 billion people, and could geographically contain the United States, China, India, and even much of Europe combined. Yet, despite this scale and diversity, Africa is still often reduced to overly simplistic narratives. Moving beyond these narratives, we want to focus on hard macro and microeconomic realities and the major global shifts shaping them today. To explore this, I am joined today by 2 distinguished experts. We have Professor Dr. Flassbeck. He is a German economist and former State Secretary of the German Federal Ministry of Finance. He is widely known for his critical perspective on global economic governance, income distribution, and international trade, and for challenging conventional economic orthodoxy with strong macroeconomic lens. We also have with us Dr. Patrick Kaczmarczyk, an economist at the University of Mannheim, specializing in political economy and current economic affairs in Germany and Europe. With a background in development consulting and international trade organization, he offers insightful analysis on geopolitical risks and the evolving global economic landscape. He has brought fresh findings and analysis directly from various African countries, such as Zimbabwe and Congo. We are very delighted to have you with us. Good day and a warm welcome, Professor Flassbeck. Welcome, Dr. Kaczmarczyk.
Yeah, thank you from our side. I'm speaking for my friend Patrick. We're happy to be here, and we will share some views with you and the audience. We have been talking in the past already on this channel about many global affairs. We have been talking about Nigeria. We have been talking about macroeconomic conditions. We have been talking about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and its role in Africa. And as today we want to go, with the help of Patrick, a bit deeper into some of the mainly macroeconomic problems in some African countries. Let me say a few words, a bit summarizing what we have been discussing in the past 2 years. First of all, my main point was always that macroeconomics is too much ignored, is put aside. People talk about development aid, they talk about this and that, they talk about structures, they talk about corruption, they talk about I don't know what, red tape and so. But hardly ever you find an economist talking about the real macroeconomic, the important macroeconomic facts on the ground in the countries. And then we have been looking at Nigeria, and for example, we saw that the macroeconomic conditions are really not good. People are complaining about many, many things. In my discussion with a Nigerian economist, we had been a lot of problems identified. But the big but is always that the macroeconomic conditions are not given the weight that they should have. And I think the weight is enormous because if we do not consider the macroeconomic conditions appropriately, we will not get to a real diagnosis and analysis of the country's problems. Because you can have corruption in a country, you can have bad governance, and I don't know what. If the macroeconomic conditions are not okay, this will all not help. It will not help to overcome the problems, because against negative or prohibitive macroeconomic conditions, mainly high interest rates or an overvalued exchange rate, it is practically impossible to stride and to get somewhere, to get onto a growth path that is sustainable and reliable. So this we should today, if possible, put a bit focus on that, and then come later to the more global questions. So I pass over to Patrick with this.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation. As for my end, I can only confirm what Heiner just said. I think it's not just a kind of African problem, but a generic one. Also, when we talk about the economic conditions in Europe, for example, we often don't really talk about, or we don't want to talk about macroeconomic indicators such as interest rates, or exchange rates, or real exchange rates. We kind of like tend to ignore it, and the same actually happens in many of the projects that I was involved with various African countries. So one looks at, I don't know, different sectoral aspects of what's going on in human capital formation, for example, what's going on in the infrastructure sector, what is going on with the energy sector, and so on. But the big elephant in the room, which basically affects all of that, is kind of just often put aside, ignored. it is a little bit like the air for human beings, or water for a fish. We are kind of like so immersed into it that we don't really recognize it anymore, with detrimental effects to development outcomes. So on the various projects that I've been working on, for example, there were three which I picked out. You mentioned Zimbabwe and Congo, but also Djibouti was actually one of the first development projects that I had with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And we used an indicator to look at what economists often call the real development, right? The real sector, the real economy, without looking into these macroeconomic aggregates. But once you do take it into account, you realize that you can actually explain quite a bit of what's going on in the real sector. For example, let's take Djibouti. It's very small East African economy, which is geopolitically quite relevant. So all the big powers have military bases in there, and their main asset that they have is a harbor, pretty much, which overshadows the entire economy. It is an LDC, so one of the least developed countries in the world, and it strives to leave that status behind. So for that, you need to basically tick off certain boxes. You have to meet certain thresholds based on national income per capita, based on economic and environmental vulnerability, and on human assets. There are certain thresholds which are being set, and then you can or you have to at least meet two of them, or if you have a comparatively high national income, you can also graduate from the LDC category just by having a very, very high income figure. When you have basically excessive dependencies, be it on harbor, for example, in the service sector, or on extractives, for example, the main problem is that your economy is very vulnerable to changes in price swings to those commodities, or in the case of a harbor, basically that you don't really have any diversity. And when something happens to that harbor, for example, in Djibouti, they are very dependent on Ethiopia, that they basically use their harbor to get access to the sea. Then you don't really have a resilient economy, and not one which generates good welfare standards and good standards of living in the breadth of the economy, apart from a certain elite. And when we look at Djibouti, one of the very interesting things about it from a monetary perspective is that it has one of the oldest currency boards in the world. So what is a currency board, for those who might not know? It is basically, they have their own currency, the Djibouti franc, but for every Djibouti franc that is being created, they need to have reserves in place to meet the exchange rate, right? So the one US dollar is about, as far as I remember, around 177 Djibouti franc. So you basically, if you want to issue 177 Djibouti franc, you have to have $1 of reserves somewhere, and usually you hold it in some sort of bank in New York or something, so that it's very safe, which means that you are very constrained in terms of what you can do. And in fact, in Djibouti, for example, you have had the same nominal exchange rate since 1973. I mean, this is something which, when you encounter that, it's just absolutely mind-blowing that this exchange rate hasn't really changed, whereas the inflation rate, the price level, of course, it went up a lot more in Djibouti than it did in the United States over time, which means that the Djibouti franc in real terms is overvalued. So basically, you can't really compete when you are an enterprise in Djibouti, because your currency is in real terms just way too expensive, and the imports against you, which you would compete, are way too cheap. They are very proud of that arrangement because it generates stability. The IMF is praising it at every opportunity that it managed to get low inflation. But the problem is you have very high interest rates. You have no diversification of the economy. You have an overvalued currency. And this is why the economy also is struggling to diversify, to fight poverty, to fight unemployment. Unemployment figures for the past decades have been always more than 25%. So you have a lot of side effects based on that monetary constraints, or the straitjacket, the monetary straitjacket that you have, which might generate price stability in that sense. But price stability, of course, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for development, so that the situation overall remains very fragile, and the excessive dependencies on this one harbor that they have basically overshadows the entire economy. A different example where monetary policy conditions have been incredibly wild is Zimbabwe, a very large economy. It used to be one of the wealthiest African or sub-Saharan African economies. But for the past 20, 25 years, they also had huge problems with inflation, hyperinflation in the late 2000s, which eroded savings and which led to a kind of like multi-currency system. This is also something that we observe across different economies, that when you realize that you can't really control the price level, you can't really have internal or external stability of your currency, what you do is basically that you dollarize. And in a sense, that happened also in Zimbabwe. You had a multi-currency regime that was put in place in 2009, which was formalized in 2014. And it was basically literally all currencies that you can think of that are a bit more liquid that were part of that RTGS dollar. So it was the US dollar obviously was the dominant one, but also the euro, the yen, the pound, all of that played a role. They could not really defend or guarantee price stability through that new currency that they had. They encountered again inflation problems, which they kind of tried to tackle with very high interest rates. And in 2024, they introduced a gold-backed currency, which was also praised by the IMF, the World Bank, and others, because it's as safe as it can get. And there again, we have conditions which are absolutely not suitable to such a gold-backed currency. The problem with a gold-backed currency is that you are, well, fiscally incredibly constrained. You can't really react. You have a fixed set of gold that there is, and you have unstable demand on the credit side. Yeah, I mean the basic conditions are very, very difficult. Additionally, in Zimbabwe, you have a problem that you have a very low level of currency reserves. You have permanent deficits. So in the case of a run on that currency, there is not really that much that you can do to defend it. And indeed, last year they had to devalue by, I think it was around order of magnitude of around 30 or 40%, because their currency was just excessively overvalued. Now it has been gaining again a little bit of strength in recent months against the US dollar, but it's nowhere near of an arrangement that secures good monetary conditions for development. And the latest example on which I was working was in the DRC, where you also have this kind of double sin, if you want, of incredibly high real interest rates. So in an economy that is growing 5, 6, 7%, and this also mainly due to population growth, you had real interest rates of around 15, 16, 17% usually in the last few years. And you have an incredibly dollarized economy there. So over 90% of deposits and credit, for example, is denominated in US dollars. So you don't really have any monetary policy tools at your disposal. And with this high interest rate environment, it makes it again very difficult to invest, right? I mean, in an economy that is growing just a few percentage points a year, if you have to cover capital costs, which are 3 or 4 times as high, there is no chance that you as a normal entrepreneur take on the credit, invest in kind of like restructuring the productive base, because you just can't afford to basically pay back the debt that you took on. So that kind of shows how the monetary conditions can really entrench and reinforce a model of development which is pretty much based on the extraction of resources, be it minerals or others, or as in the case of Djibouti, centered around one asset that they have for services with their harbor. But what really generates improvement in living standards, productivity growth, diversification of the economy, this is simply impossible under such conditions. So before you go into various sectoral analyses, or as Heiner mentioned, you talk about corruption or red tape or whatever, you should really fix kind of the foundation that is wrong. Otherwise, it's a little bit like discussing, which color of your house or which color do you want for your windows or for your door, while the very foundation on which that house is built is incredibly fragile. So these are just three kind of recent examples on which I've been working, and which kind of show very nicely and concretely how very difficult monetary conditions prevent countries from catching up and from diversifying.
Thank you very much for that in-depth finding. I noticed, Professor Flassbeck, you were kind of smiling. Do you have something to say to all these discoveries from Dr. Kaczmarczyk's findings before we talk about policies and what the government should do to change some of the economic situations in the different countries?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I try, and thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. It was very, very helpful. And I want to. Nobody would believe what I'm saying now, but unfortunately it's true. The main problem is that in these countries, I'm sure nobody would believe me if I say the IMF has no idea what inflation is and how to handle inflation. And the second is the IMF has no idea what a adequate exchange rate regime for developing countries is. These two crucial questions are totally unanswered in the IMF. I've been talking with IMF people back 20, 25 years ago. I'm reading their literature today. I'm seeing their lady president the last week, and I'm absolutely sure they have no idea. They have no idea how to handle inflation. If you look what Mrs. Georgieva said last week about Europe and Europe's problems, she has no idea. She has no idea about Europe's problems. And if you look at my experience with the IMF in the past, I can tell you, even in the IMF, there have been all the time smart people who know that there is a major problem with the exchange rate system. But I tell you, and I have to tell everyone outside there, believe it or not, they are not allowed to talk frankly about it. They're not allowed. Why are they not allowed? Because the Americans do not want the US government, it's not Trump or Bush or whoever, all the governments, no government, including Obama, no government in the United States wants to talk about a question like a stable exchange rate regime, because there are these nice guys out in Wall Street who give us so much money for our party and for everything. So we cannot discuss it. We do not want to discuss it, and we do not allow the IMF to discuss it. It's very simple like that. I have to give a simple example. We had a currency war in Brazil when I was at UNCTAD in Geneva. We had a currency war. The finance minister of Brazil called it a currency war because the Brazilian real was appreciated in a time when they had much higher inflation rates than all the currencies they were appreciated to, namely the Japanese yen. So what happened? There was speculation, a simple speculation. It's called carry trade. It's the most simple speculation under the sun. You carry money from a low interest rate country to a high interest rate country, and you earn millions or billions or whatever. Nobody cares, and nobody talks about it. But who is suffering is the country that is totally overvalued in the end. It is dramatically suffering. And then we had, I tell you, then Brazil forced a discussion in the WTO here in Geneva, here in my neighborhood, forced a discussion in the WTO about exchange rate regimes and their role for trade. And there were the four chief economists of the big institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, and me for UNCTAD. You know what happened? Everyone except me said, "Oh, this is a difficult question. We do not know. We do not have the research. Unfortunately, it's very complex. We do not have the research actually to give you an answer whether this is speculation or something. We do not know." And then came the next. That was the IMF. Then came the World Bank and said, "Oh, I have to fully share the view of my friend from the IMF. Unfortunately, we are in the same position. No clear idea, no research. We have to go deep into it. We will, in I don't know when, we will deliver research, but we have nothing, unfortunately." Then came the OECD guy and said, "Oh, it's very complex. I can only share the view of my colleagues. It's very complex." And then came Heiner Flassbeck and said, "Oh, it's not complex at all. It's very simple. It's speculation. It's speculation driven by Wall Street and the City of London. You do not want to talk about it. That's all." That at that moment, the American delegation left the room. So they didn't want to hear it. I can understand why they didn't want to hear it, because they knew it's the truth. And as long as we are in such a situation, for countries, it is more or less impossible. It's more or less impossible to get out of this trapped situation. You are trapped either in, like Djibouti, absolutely fixed exchange rate. The currency board is the most crazy system under the sun that you can imagine, and then keep the exchange rate stable for decades without keeping the inflation rate at the US level is absurd. It's killing everything in the country, everything except for this one, the harbor, or what it is, or some commodities that you dig out of the earth. It kills everything, and this is what stops Africa from developing. But on the other hand, I can imagine there is no. It is very difficult, even for me. It was very difficult to go to the IMF and tell them, "Oh, boys, you have no ideas what you're talking about." Huh? I said it. I have to tell you, I talked to Stanley Fischer at that time, a very famous economist and vice president of the IMF. I told him, "You have no idea about exchange rate systems. So be honest and tell the countries that there's no way that they came with corner solutions. Either absolutely fixed or absolutely flexible. It's nonsense. It can be reasonable to have a corner solution for a year or two, but then Argentina failed and Brazil failed. Then they said, "Oh no, maybe it's not corner solution. Maybe you should go for absolutely flexible." But they know absolutely flexible does also not work. So it's nothing that works. And in this situation, it's extremely difficult for an African minister or an African economist to go to Washington and tell them, "Well, guys, to work with you is useless." But because they have to work with them, because there's only one institution in this world that helps you out if you're really in trouble. And this is the IMF. And we have given the IMF the monopoly, but not only the monopoly about money, about dollars, but the monopoly about ideas. And this is hindering development in the whole developing world, including Africa, more than anything else.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaczmarczyk and Professor Flassbeck, for so much insights. It's very clear that the African countries are under immense macroeconomic pressure. But as we've seen, these nations are not isolated economic systems. They are deeply tied to the shifting global, I would call it, chessboard. And that is exactly where we'll pick up in our next episode. We've talked about different themes during our last episodes with Professor Flassbeck, and all the things you've mentioned. I've seen it. I've seen it in different countries in Africa. Nigeria has the flexible currency rate, and we have the example of Djibouti. None of them is working, so I can confirm this. So a huge thank you to Dr. Kaczmarczyk and Professor Heiner Flassbeck for laying this crucial groundwork today. We will be continuing with more information on the effect of what is happening in the global economy in our next episode, in episode 2. I hope you will join us for the next podcast. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Professor Flassbeck, and thank you, Dr. Kaczmarczyk.
You're welcome.
Thank you.